I'd like to give a brief content warning before I start this episode. I'm going to discuss grooming, sexual predation, and abusive relationships. If that's not something you feel like you can handle listening to right now, I won't blame you if you skip this one. Hello, my name is Amber, and this is You Look Like a Badger, a monthly podcast where I discuss queer cinema. It is August, and we have a touch of the dramatic because we're going to be discussing a drama film, which is the genre that is. I'm very good at explaining things today, obviously. If you haven't listened to any of my other episodes, this season of the show has been dedicated to discussing controversial / offensive / any film that's had any amount of discourse surrounding it. Anything that has ruffled some feathers. And this one definitely has. This month's film is Call Me By Your Name.
Call me by your name and I'll call you by mine. Yeah.
Call Me By Your Name is a 2017 film based on a book of the same name, following a teenage boy as he explores his sexuality while spending the summer in Italy with his parents, pursuing a 24-year-old man in the process. Considered a masterpiece by many, this film seemed to capture the stillness that a summer holiday seems to have on time, allowing the fantasy of the on-screen relationship to seem endless, a rare occurrence for gay men in movies. Still, it had and continues to have many detractors who view it as a means for normalising large age gaps in queer relationships and promoting an unhealthy dynamic between Elio and Oliver with very little criticism within the text. This film was nominated and won many awards. It has a whole Wikipedia page dedicated to it, so I'm not going to go through all of those, but I am going to say that it won the Best Adapted Screenplay at the Academy Awards and was nominated for Best Picture. Timothée Chalamet was nominated for Best Actor, and Mystery of Love was nominated for Best Original Song. It has a 94% critic score on Rotten Tomatoes and a 86% audience score, and on Letterboxd it has a 3.9. I am going to read some of the reviews like I normally do, but it's kind of mad how, when I was going through the reviews on Letterboxd, how every other review, here's how it would go on the page. It would be someone declaring it a masterpiece, talking about how it made them feel, how it made them cry, how it was very personal to them, and then the immediate review after that would be, this is an incredibly harmful film, it shouldn't have the audience that it does. That was kind of the experience of reading the Letterboxd reviews, so to say this film is polarizing is kind of an understatement. Trying to gauge an overall reaction of the public was quite hard. The reviews this time aren't as funny, mainly because I was trying to get a scope of the discourse without spoiling the film yet. You're gonna get a microcosm of all of the discourse that this film has kind of spurned on. So we'll start with a review from Sally Jane Black, who wrote, "The scenery is gorgeous, and at times the film finds close-ups and low angles that turn these people into something more than dull tools of patriarchy. But even were it a well-crafted film overall, it would still not make up for the apparent themes of normalizing abusive relationships." I think in terms of film discourse, the word normalizing, it asks filmmakers to hold a very morally good standard. And the problem with that is that it sanitizes stories. I'm being very tentative because I'm going to be very honest, I'm still trying to work out how I feel about this film, because it has such a complicated legacy at this point that maybe it should just be abandoned and we should just give up and move towards something else. But with regards to this specific review, I think it kind of turns the characters in the film into very two-dimensional figures, and it looks at their ages and nothing else. And I think it is more complicated than that. I don't think I like that film criticism has come to what should and shouldn't be represented on screen. And I think that's what I had an issue with in terms of this review. This next review is by Sofyan, and it says, probably the best father-son conversation I've heard in my life. I think a lot of people were affected by that relationship on screen and how it comes to inform the depiction of queerness. I'm not going to go into too much detail, mainly because it'll spoil a bunch of things, but I think people really like the performances and they really like the writing, and it is definitely affecting. I'm going to give a spoiler warning. If you haven't seen the film and you think that this podcast would ruin that for you, you can go watch it instead of listening to this, or not. It's up to you. I'm not your mum, and I don't control what you do with your life. You can spoil this film for yourself if you want. I'm not going to stop you, but I'm giving you the opportunity to walk away. So you can do that. Spoilers ahead.
Elio. You sleeping?
I was.
Listen to this drivel. Tell me what you think. For the early Greeks, Heidegger contends, this underlying hiddenness is constitutive of the way beings are, not only in relation to themselves, but also in relation to other entities generally. In other words, they do not construe hiddenness merely or primarily in terms of entities' relations to human beings. Does that make any sense to you? It doesn't make any sense to me. I don't think it makes any sense to your dad either.
Maybe you did when you wrote it.
That might be the kindest thing anybody has said to me in months.
Kind?
Yep. Kind.
I'm going to begin by talking about what queer movies kind of represent. For the most part, they've come to exist as either Oscar bait or indie projects that nobody has seen and they have to be like rediscovered 30 years later. So I think, what is the extent that we're allowed to have queer films that are considered like high art? So they're visually stunning and they deal with kind of dense and difficult subjects. They have the air of intellectualism about them, and they ask the audience to do some work when it comes to watching them. So it's not simply passive fluff. It's not stuff that you're used to seeing. It's kind of pushing the boundaries a bit, and it's dealing with stuff that I suppose would be considered formally impressive. So this is the kind of film that maybe even 10 years before its release, it would have struggled to get like a wide distribution, to at the New York Film Festival playing to a sold out crowd that gave it a 10-minute standing ovation. So I think in terms of what it means for queer movies, and we are like post Moonlight, post Brokeback Mountain. This would also be post Carol as well. Just movies about gay people in the mainstream that can be considered art and can't be misconstrued as like lip service. In an interview with James Ivory, the writer of the film, he said the following, which was, I think audiences are probably really quite hungry for stories like that, which are just unavowed romances and done lightly. Something that's light in tone and not some huge melodrama. I think it's that people love romances told in this kind of way. Romances that have a kind of glamour to them. The glamour is partly supplied by Italy and partly supplied by Luca. The world he chooses to depict in his movies, upper middle class, well-off worlds of people living privileged lives, usually in some wonderful house, that appeals to people. I'm not saying it's bad or good, it's just simply something that we like, and I too like it. The world of the film functions as an escape for its characters, and by extension an escape for the audience. It's access to a world that maybe the audience wouldn't have had otherwise, because in a sense it feels almost otherworldly, because it's very idyllic and bright, and it's very much fantasy fulfillment, where there are very few consequences for the actions depicted in the film. So there's never really a threat of like hate crimes or actual punishment. It is kind of mentioned by Oliver that he would have probably been punished by his own father if the same thing had happened to him when he was Elio's age. So it's this kind of world that it uses its setting to entice and I guess disarm the audience into thinking they're going to be preached at about queer issues, or they fear that they're going to have to think in a very politicized way, which LGBT stories often are. It's a film that can therefore be seen as more universal and is probably the reason that it has kind of stayed in people's minds for as long as it has. So there's a quote from The Hollywood Reporter that says, "It stands out in the canon of queer cinema in having no overt political message or element of moral judgment or reckoning. There are no villains in the film, and shame never rears its ugly head." It's very much something that wants to be thought of in kind of a very high-minded and classy way. And because of that, it does cut around a lot of the more political elements. There is an allusion to the fascist roots of Italy. When Elio and Oliver stop at an old woman's house, they see a picture on the wall of Mussolini. But it's kind of a blink and you'll miss it moment. Much of the plot is not asking you to think about this time period. It's not asking you to think about fascism. It's discussing religion and I guess like philosophical topics, but it's not asking you to engage with the AIDS crisis, for example, which is a criticism many people have had. It doesn't really ask you to engage with the age gap, engage with the possibility of legitimate punishment. It doesn't exist in the film. Elio is very much supported in every way in his pursuit of his desire and his want for romance. He doesn't really experience pushback. And I think it's a means for not alienating the audience, but I don't want to be cynical, because the director is a gay man. And I think wanting to depict queerness in a way that's kind of free from punishment, I guess, is just like a fantasy fulfillment sequence. And it's not even like it's a film free from tragedy. Like the bulk of the film is Oliver and Elio not being together, but them longing for each other and then getting to be together, but only for a short period of time to the point where it ends. I suppose like this film differs from something like, say, Heartstopper, which is fresh in my mind because I just finished watching the second season. It's different to that series because one, Heartstopper is very much intended for a younger audience, but it's also, I think Heartstopper is intended to be like fluff, whereas Call Me By Your Name takes itself very seriously and it does ask its audience to do the same. But what connects Call Me By Your Name and Heartstopper is they're both able to play out queer issues within like a safe environment, and it comes with a lot of fantasy fulfillment within that. I'd say that Call Me By Your Name is far less didactic, but I think they both kind of portray a world that's free from legitimate, I guess, like deadly consequences for the actions of queerness. In the case of Call Me By Your Name, this kind of serves to create a utopia, and I think utopia is kind of a place that queer movies rarely get to go. And I think that is what kind of it differs it from many other mainstream queer movies.
I don't think he's arrogant.
Just watch. This is how he'll say goodbye to us when the time comes. With his later.
Meanwhile, we'll have to put up with him for 6 long weeks, won't we, darling?
I think he's shy. You'll grow to like him.
What if I grow to hate him?
As with any kind of coming of age story, the main character usually has to start off in a place of immaturity and move towards a place of maturity, usually adulthood, usually a realization of truth, of like fantasies being shattered, but an acceptance of that reality or not. Sometimes it's very tragic. I think that's kind of the case for this film. What Oliver seems to represent for Elio, not just in terms of a romantic interest or an object of affection or like a microcosm of his desire, Oliver kind of models confident masculinity that Elio doesn't feel as though he has access to. I think I'd actually argue that many queer stories, whether that's those of queer subtext or they are queer in text, you'll often find that romantic queer interests can serve as mirrors of the main character or like aspirational. Sometimes this kind of leads to violence and I guess like toxic intertwining. I'm thinking of like Black Swan or Mulholland Drive. In the case of this film, it does manifest sexually and romantically, but it's also like a place of, I guess, realization for Elio that here is this kind of man who, he's American, I guess, like the main family, and he's also Jewish, and he's older, and he is able to move around, and he does so with confidence. One of the first things we see Oliver do is aggressively eat an egg. Like we see he taps open the boiled egg and it explodes, and then he gets another egg and he eats it. And we also see how Oliver can just like walk into a room and assimilate like immediately. Like he does it with a card game where Elio asks Oliver, hey, do you know these people? How are you able to just like join in their game? Oliver doesn't really give an answer, I think because it's like an ability that comes quite naturally to him. But we see that despite the fact that Oliver is not native to Italy and he doesn't really speak the language, he's able to find his feet really quickly, whereas Elio is a polyglot and he's very smart and talented. He really struggles to stand out in a room, and he also does frequently throw like tantrums and will just like be really stubborn and not want to participate with other people. He can't walk into the middle of a dance floor and just start dancing. He has to stare at Oliver for a really long time before he's able to do that. The relationship with Marzia is a really kind of excellent example of Elio's immaturity, because it's very much a performance of heterosexuality, but also like a version of masculinity that I think deep down Elio thinks will impress Oliver and also his father, but it doesn't really do that for either of them. And I think unfortunately Marzia becomes a tool for distracting Elio from Oliver, and I suppose it becomes like a way for Elio to exercise his queer desire. And I think Marzia kind of gets tossed away after Elio is able to pursue this in actuality. You'll notice that his sex scenes with Marzia are the only ones that are on screen, and I think there's some criticism from both the screenwriter and audiences where it seemed as though the director was hiding queer sex from the camera. I think I've watched this film a significant amount of times now, and I think I've come to kind of realise that it's more that for Elio, I think traditional heterosexual sex is very performative for him, hence why it is performed for the camera, whereas gay sex is intimate and very human and very much not performative, hence why the camera pans away and we don't get to see it. I will say that I don't love the trope of like the beard, and I know that it happens in real life and that straight women kind of become collateral in gay men's sexual exploration. It's a very complicated issue. I think just in the case of this film, Marzia just gets the short end of the stick. Like she ends up being like not really mad at him and just wanting to be friends at the end of it, which I think feels like a bit of a cop-out. I know it would be like kicking someone while they're down, but maybe just like Marzia kind of understanding that Elio isn't a very good friend might have been a good kick up the arse for Elio to, I guess, like inform his relationship to women and what that means now, because I don't feel like he has to reckon with that. And I know it's a gay movie and it's about gay things and that gayness is at the centre of it and is prioritised. It always makes me feel weird, like it just does. I think Marzia deserved better. Part of this coming of age means, I guess, reckoning with what it means to feel ashamed of yourself and what that is versus what the consequences of pursuing queerness in this time period. So there is like an outward distancing coming from Elio towards queerness. He like performs finding women attractive in front of Oliver, and he makes fun of the gay couple that comes and stays with his parents. And this is very much, I guess, without explicitly telling the audience what has happened to this boy, what he feels as though he has to say in order to not be punished for what he wants, which is why a lot of the more sexual stuff is followed by moments of shame, where Elio puts Oliver's trunks on his head and then he like immediately feels ashamed. And then there's the peach scene where the peach scene, I'm not going into it, but it's like a moment of sexual exploration. And then when he's found by Oliver, he uses the word sick. He says, "I'm sick, aren't I?" Becoming more mature, coming of age, is kind of the realization that shame comes from outside of ourselves and it's not simply natural. I think Oliver is a lot more aware of the consequences. So where Elio is very loud about his homophobia, I guess, is more casual instances of homophobia and performative masculinity, Oliver is very aware of the actual consequences, which is not like silly comments calling a gay couple Sonny and Cher. It's being like exiled from your family. It's being punished by society. And all of these are kind of unsaid. We don't actually see or hear the consequences of their actions, but it's always alluding to a sense of obligation bigger than the characters. And I think Elio has to come to terms with this and, I guess, externalize that shame as he's pursuing it. And I think this comes as like a realization of his behavior. There's a lot of, I guess, like reflecting on time wasted that could have been spent together. But I think there's also Oliver, I guess, becomes a voice of what the actuality of his belief system is. I mean, it's not simply that it's sick or shameful, it's that there are stuff that has actual weight to it and actual punishment attached to it. So Oliver says that if his father had seen him acting the way that Elio had been acting when pursuing this relationship, that he would have been carted off to a correctional facility. And I think there's this sense that Oliver has ended up like Elio's father, who we get the sense that is also some flavour of queer. And I guess there's this realisation that it's not a shame that is natural, it's a shame that comes from outside, and it's temporary. It's a world, I guess, of innocence that can't really exist, that shame is not naturally occurring, it's something that comes from outside sources. I think the unsaid thing of that is that if it's coming from outside and it's not a naturally occurring essence, then it can be fixed and changed, and that it's not currently being changed. And why is it not currently being changed? What is standing in the way of us not thinking of queerness as shameful or sick or needing to be hidden away? What about the world is asking that of us? And I think Elio not only gets the gift of, I guess, Oliver as a model of masculinity, he kind of gets the emotional maturity to understand what has actually happened, to understand why it is that they can't be together at the end.
You're not sick of me yet?
No, I just wanted to be with you. I'm gonna I'll go.
Do you know how happy I am that we slept together?
I don't know.
Of course you don't know. I don't want you to regret anything. And I hate the thought that maybe I may have messed you up. I don't want either of us to pay for this.
No, it's not like I'm gonna tell anyone. You're not gonna be like in any trouble.
That's not what I'm talking about.
We are yet to discuss the age gap. I have mentioned it in passing, but the bulk of why people don't like this film is because it is problematic, which is a word that has lost all its meaning, specifically because it depicts a relationship between a 17-year-old boy and a 24-year-old man without much criticism or self-reflection, or I guess understanding of that power dynamic and what it means to have two characters be that age, and no real reflection on what that does to the power dynamics of the relationship. When tackling this, I don't want to talk about it in a binary way, mainly because I think it's more complicated than people have given it credit for. And I think people have thrown around terms like grooming and abusive without much consideration for the context of the film or the contexts for films in general, which is that depiction is not necessarily endorsement, but at the same time, depiction itself is not necessarily commentary. Being frustrated that a film simply deals with something you're not comfortable with isn't necessarily fair. I mean, you can feel discomfort about it, but I don't think it's fair to argue that no one can enjoy it or get anything from it without considering what it is that makes up the film. So I think an understanding that, as I've talked about in previous sections, this film is kind of a utopian space, a fantasy space for Elio to act out his desire in like a safe and controlled environment with a man he finds attractive without consequences. That seems to be what the film is a fantasy space. I think the fact that they're all very intellectual and they're speaking different languages and they're constantly talking about art and philosophy kind of signals the audience that way, that this is not necessarily the most grounded, down-to-earth film, and that what is happening is, I guess, a safe venue for a queer teenager who maybe hasn't had access to queer adults at all, or access to a safe exploration of sexuality, to kind of play that out. And the fact that it doesn't necessarily have a happy ending kind of speaks to the previous section where I was talking about a story of maturity, of someone coming to the realization that this fantasy is a fantasy and it's not a sustainable state. So I think when people talk about endorsement, they forget that the film ends with Elio on his own, him not having a relationship with this man. And I think it's quite simplistic to argue that this is simply a relationship of power dynamics, when I think it's more a case of a relationship of fantasy where Elio gets to yearn and look at a man that he finds attractive, and he gets to be touched by this man, he gets to be kissed by this man, and there aren't consequences for those actions. Lola Sebastian has an excellent video on this movie. It's very comprehensive. It answers any and all questions of why people don't like this film. So I would guide you towards that if you are interested in hearing a more extensive look at the film. There is a specific part where she discusses, I guess, Oliver's quote-unquote admission of guilt, where he says something along the lines of, "You won't hold this against me," or I don't want you to regret what's happening. And I think people interpreted that as an admission of being guilty of grooming or paedophilia or sexual abuse. What she argues is that it's kind of missing the forest for the trees, where it's more likely that Oliver is contemplating his position in the closet, not being critical of the age gap or acting suspiciously or trying to dilute his own guilt. She also has some excellent knowledge on the misuse of the term grooming in internet spaces, where it's more the goal of grooming is sexual abuse. It's to lower someone's defenses and gain their trust, to like isolate them, to then abuse them. Whereas in this film, Oliver and Elio do everything in their power to avoid one another. It's coming to a conclusion, having not watched the film, and then retroactively finding evidence to support it. It's confirmation bias. I think people wanted to hate this film because they realised that it had elements of it that made them uncomfortable, and then they went back and found specific instances of stuff that could be taken out of context and used against it. But I don't think it's fair to do that. Do I support the age gap in the film? I don't think so, no. I think the film could have easily have been told from the perspective of like a university student who was particularly immature. And I think there's stuff about it that could have been, I suppose, done better, where it doesn't feel as though Elio is like a small child who's petulant and stubborn. I think that there is a lot about this film that could have worked without the age difference. But I also think that getting involved in discourse about a film that you haven't seen is bad. I've said it before, I'll say it again. You can only have an opinion on a movie if you've actually seen it. I sometimes fall into the trap of hating a film before I've even seen it and forming an opinion based on that initial feeling, but that isn't fair of me, and it isn't fair of other people to do that either. I was going back and forth on whether to talk about Armie Hammer, but he is, whether we like it or not, kind of involved in the discourse around this film. I think it kind of cropped back up once the allegations around him came into the public eye. I think people have kind of projected those feelings onto this movie, and it has kind of informed that as well. I'll give a brief rundown. I know I gave a content warning at the beginning, but I am going to say here, I'm not going to go into details. If you are, I guess, desperate to learn the details, you can look them up for yourself, but I'm not going to disclose them here. I don't think it's necessary, but I will give like a brief rundown of Armie Hammer. So back in 2021, an anonymous Instagram account released screenshots of messages that Hammer had allegedly sent to women he'd had affairs with between 2016 and 2020. In various conversations, he was shown describing his sexual fantasies, including violence, rape, and cannibalism. He had a proclivity for dating fans who were much younger than him. He's denied claims of sexual assault and violence, and has maintained that all of his relationships were consensual. Having Armie Hammer in this role for a movie that is already kind of marred with the discussions of the power dynamics of age gaps, to then also have the Armie Hammer legacy on top of it as well. I don't know if it's just like a personal thing, if other people do this, but it's kind of, I've fully stopped being able to separate art from artist. I don't think it's possible, and I think those that claim to be able to do it are in denial, or they just don't care. But I think, honestly, the real life discussions of what Armie Hammer has done in comparison to what the film chooses to depict kind of shows how glaringly wrong a lot of the discourses around it, specifically because, and you know, depiction has a lot to do with this, but Elio is never pursued. Like I said, they spend most of the film avoiding each other, so it's never a case of predation, whereas the real life stuff, there's usually a pattern to it, and the power dynamic is usually emphasized immediately, whereas I don't think it is in this film. That's not to say that I'm like in love with the age gap and that I think it's explored in the best way. I don't think it is. I almost feel like people do themselves a disservice by taking everything a film is showing you at face value and not like digging further into it. I think it kind of brushes over what many queer people desire, which is a sense of stability and a safe place to, I guess, explore their own sexuality, which Elio is given in this film, and not many people have that. I don't think it can, in good faith, be compared to real-life allegations of sexual assault and domestic violence. I don't think that's fair. I also don't think it's correct, like, objectively. This is unfortunately a very messy film to like. I've seen it multiple times, and it's very hard for me to kind of come out of it and not feel a bit weird about it. Like, I still, even as I'm talking about it, I'm not sure if I like it. I know that I don't hate it, and I think I have an affinity for it, and I think I'm more generous to it than I think other people have been. In terms of, does it look like a badger? I think my initial review, when I watched it for the first time, this was like long after Discourse had already gone around the street and back again, was I think I would have been obsessed with it if I'd watched it when it first came out, because I think there's something really interesting in how it represents feeling inferior to those around you, feeling kind of isolated by heterosexuality, and feeling like a strong desire that you are almost certain is never going to be reciprocated. It's a fantasy that allows that to be played out. Still, I think that the amount of controversy surrounding the film now makes it feel strange. I think it just does. I don't think that's going to go away for me. Even if I can reason out what the film is doing and how it's doing it quite well, I think it's hard to kind of settle on one way of viewing it. Even without all that, I think some people are just not going to like it because it's very slow and it's very white and upper middle class, and it's not particularly radical in terms of its politics, at least. It's not something that's pushing many boundaries outside of the controversies that it's incurred. I think it's only fair that I give you some recommendations to take away with you. This podcast has been really hard for me to record. I had like a moment in the middle of recording where I just couldn't speak, so I had to take a break and start again, which was really frustrating, and I don't like when that happens. I'm going to give you some treats to take away with you, some films to watch. If you liked Call Me By Your Name, or you wanted like a different version of it that's, I guess, like less marred with discourse. So I've got 3 movies for you today. The first one is called I Am Jonas. It's a drama about a man reflecting on his relationship that he had as a teenager and attempting to process those feelings as he's confronted with his then boyfriend's family. And I'm not going to give you any more information than that. This film is joyful in moments and very painful in others. I think I was very blown away by it. I think it's a Netflix original as well, but I'm not quite sure about that. But yeah, I think it's a lot, and it's not really a film many people have watched. So that one. This next one was literally nominated for the most awards of any awards. It's a Portrait of a Lady on Fire. So the plot of it, if you somehow have not managed to watch it, it's a female artist who is commissioned to paint a woman, and this painting is going to be a wedding present for her betrothed. But what actually ends up happening is they end up falling in love, and they are on this isolated island together, and it becomes like a utopia for queer exploration. It's also just like a lot emotionally. So be prepared. All of these recommendations are very emotionally taxing, so be prepared. The last recommendation is My Own Private Idaho. It's about 2 men. They are hustlers, and they travel from Portland, Oregon to Idaho, and then finally to Italy on a quest to find one of their estranged mothers. And on the way, they have to do some sex work and explore their feelings for one another. If they exist, they might not. And it's upsetting. It's very good, but it is upsetting. So yeah, I'd watch that one as well. So we are done. I want to thank you very much for listening. I'm going to be doing my next episode in September on queer comedies. If you'd like to stay updated, please make sure to follow me on Twitter. I'm still calling it Twitter because fuck off. At Like a Badger Pod. Follow me on Spotify, YouTube and TikTok for full episodes and teasers. If you'd like to see more of my work, you can find my writing at ambercamwalk.com. And if you would like to make a donation to make sure I can buy some little snacks, you can donate to my coffee, which I'll put in the description. Everything that I've cited or has kind of influenced the research that I've done for this episode will be in the description as well. Thank you again for listening, and I hope that you come back in September. Goodbye.